You didn't deserve it anyway. Those were the first words out of my sister Claire's mouth when I confronted her about selling the condo, and I remember standing there in the parking lot of her real estate office, phone pressed to my ear, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. The Santa Monica beachfront condo that Grandma Rose had left specifically to me in her will 6 months ago, the $1.2 million property that had become my home and my sanctuary while I grieved her loss, was somehow, impossibly, gone. Claire had sold it. My own sister had sold my inheritance out from under me, and she said it like I was the one being unreasonable for questioning her. I was 28 years old, and I'd spent most of those years being the overlooked middle child, the one who was never quite as accomplished as golden child Claire, never quite as charming or successful or worthy of our parents' pride, and in that moment, all those years of being dismissed crashed over me like a wave. I'd been living in the condo since Grandma died, working remotely as a graphic designer from the small, second bedroom she'd converted into an office, walking on the beach every morning like she used to do, keeping her plants alive on the balcony, surrounding myself with her memory because it was the only thing that made the grief bearable. The condo smelled like her lavender sachets in the ocean, and every evening when the sun set over the Pacific, I would sit in her favorite chair and feel close to her again. I remember the will reading 6 months ago, sitting in the attorney's office while he explained that Grandma Rose had left the beachfront property to me, not to Claire, not split between us, but entirely to me. I remember the look on Claire's face, the way her smile had frozen and her eyes had gone hard and cold. She'd recovered quickly, of course, because Claire always did, always managed to smooth over her real feelings with a practiced laugh and a dismissive comment. "Well, that's a lot of responsibility for you, Maya," she'd said, and our parents had nodded like she was being generous instead of condescending. "I hope you're ready for property taxes and maintenance costs." But I'd seen the fury underneath, the barely concealed rage that Grandma had chosen me over her, that I'd gotten something valuable, something Claire wanted. I should have known then that she wouldn't let it go. I should have known that my sister, who'd spent our entire lives making sure I knew my place beneath her, wouldn't accept being passed over for the family property worth over $1 million. But I'd been grieving, exhausted from the weight of loss, and I'd wanted so badly to believe that maybe, finally, my family would see me as capable of something important. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, and I remember the day so clearly because I'd been feeling almost hopeful for the first time since Grandma died, had gone to the farmer's market near the condo, and bought fresh flowers like she used to do every week, picked up ingredients for her lemon chicken recipe that I was planning to make for dinner, even though I'd be eating alone. I was carrying 2 bags of groceries up the exterior stairs to the second-floor unit, already thinking about which vase I'd use for the sunflowers, when I noticed something was wrong with the door. The lock looked different, newer. I set down the groceries and tried my key, but it wouldn't turn, wouldn't even slide all the way into the slot, and I stood there confused for a full minute before the reality started to sink in that someone had changed the locks on my home. My first thought was building maintenance, maybe some kind of emergency repair I hadn't been notified about, so I called the property management company, and the woman who answered said, "Oh, Ms. Rodriguez, yes, the new owner took possession this morning and requested immediate lock changes for security purposes." New owner. The words didn't make sense. I was the owner. I told her there must be some mistake, that I was Maya Rodriguez, that my grandmother Rose Martinez had left me this property, and there was a long pause before she said carefully, "Our records show the property was sold on behalf of Maya Rodriguez by her authorized representative, Claire Rodriguez, who provided all necessary documentation including power of attorney." I called Claire immediately, hands shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone, and when she answered with her professional real estate voice, cheerful and brisk, I said, "What did you do? The management company says you sold the condo, my condo. What did you do?" There was a pause, and then she sighed like I was being tedious, like I was a difficult client who couldn't understand a simple transaction. "Maya, We need to talk about this rationally. There was a mistake in Grandma's will. She was confused in her final days. You know she had dementia, and she didn't really mean to leave the entire property to you. I felt my chest tighten, felt the familiar sensation of being made to doubt my own reality that I'd experienced so many times growing up with Claire. She was declared legally competent. There were doctors, assessments, witnesses at the will reading. Claire made a dismissive noise. Listen, I've already sold it. I got $1.3 million, which is actually $100,000 more than the estimated value, so you should be thanking me for my expertise. I had to forge your signature on some of the sale documents because you weren't being cooperative about discussing this rationally. But I used my notary seal from work, so everything's legitimate. You're too irresponsible to manage a property like that anyway, Maya. You would have let it fall apart or gotten behind on taxes. I did you a favor. The casual admission of forgery, delivered like she was explaining a minor administrative shortcut, made my head spin. I'll give you $50,000 if you don't make trouble about this, she continued. That's more than generous considering you didn't earn any of it. I thought about my college boyfriend Derek, the one Claire had systematically seduced and stolen during my junior year. How she'd convinced me afterward that he'd never really liked me anyway, that I'd been delusional to think someone like him would choose me over her. I thought about the advertising campaign concept I'd shared at a family dinner 3 years ago. How Claire had presented virtually the same idea to her real estate firm 2 weeks later and gotten a bonus and recognition, while I'd watched in silence, too conditioned to confrontation to call her out. I thought about all the times she'd convinced our parents that I was irresponsible, dramatic, too sensitive, the problem child who couldn't handle adult responsibilities, and how I'd eventually started to believe her version of me. You forged my signature, I said quietly. You committed fraud. Claire laughed, actually laughed. Don't be dramatic. I handled a complicated family situation. If you try to make trouble, I'll make sure Mom and Dad know exactly how ungrateful you're being. Now, do you want the $50,000 or not? I spent that first night on Jordan's couch in her West Hollywood apartment, still wearing the same clothes from the day before, because I hadn't been able to get into the condo to retrieve anything. And I couldn't stop crying long enough to explain coherently what had happened. Jordan had been my best friend since college, had witnessed every single time Claire had diminished me or stolen something from me or convinced our parents that I was the problem, and when I finally managed to get the whole story out between sobs, she looked at me with such fierce anger on my behalf that it almost made me cry harder. You're getting a lawyer, she said. Tomorrow. First thing. This is fraud, Maya. This is actual criminal fraud. But even hearing her say it, even knowing intellectually that Claire had committed a crime, I felt that familiar doubt creeping in. The voice that had been planted in my head over 28 years of being the overlooked middle child, telling me that maybe I was overreacting, maybe I was being dramatic, maybe Claire really did know better than me about property management and financial decisions. Maybe she's right, I heard myself say, and Jordan's expression shifted from anger to something that looked like heartbreak. Maybe I wasn't responsible enough to handle a property like that. I've never owned real estate before. I don't know anything about property taxes or maintenance or any of it, and Claire's been in real estate for 8 years. She knows what she's doing. Jordan grabbed my shoulders and made me look at her. Listen to yourself. Your sister forged your signature, sold your inheritance without your permission, and offered you 4% of the proceeds to keep quiet about it, and you're sitting here wondering if she's right that you didn't deserve it in the first place. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that it was more complicated than that, but I couldn't find the words because deep down I knew she was right. Knew that I'd been so thoroughly conditioned to accept Claire's superiority that even grand larceny wasn't enough to make me trust my own judgment over hers. I thought about Grandma Rose, about our last real conversation 2 weeks before she died, when I'd visited her in the hospice facility, and she'd taken my hand with fingers that felt like bird bones and said, "Claire doesn't know I'm leaving you the condo. Your parents will think I'm being unfair. But you were the only one who visited me because you loved me, not because you wanted something. You have a good heart, Maya. Don't let them convince you otherwise." I'd thought she meant don't let them convince me I didn't deserve her love, but sitting there on Jordan's couch, I realized she'd known exactly what would happen. Had known that Claire would try to take what was mine and that our parents would probably side with her. Had known that I would need to remember that at least one person in my family had seen my worth clearly. The grief hit me fresh and overwhelming, not just for losing Grandma, but for losing the last physical piece of her, the condo where she'd lived for 15 years, where I'd spent countless Sunday afternoons drinking tea on her balcony and listening to her stories about growing up in Mexico City, where she'd taught me to make tamales and told me about her own struggles with being underestimated by people who should have valued her. Jordan went with me to see the lawyer on Monday morning, and his office was in a modest building in Culver City. That made me feel slightly better because at least it didn't look like the kind of place that would charge $800 an hour. Derek Chen was younger than I'd expected, maybe late 30s, with a direct manner that reminded me of Jordan, and when I explained what had happened, he listened without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, and his expression grew increasingly appalled as I detailed Claire's casual admission of forgery and her offer of $50,000 to keep quiet. "This is textbook fraud," he said when I finished. "Forgery, abuse of notary public authority, possibly conspiracy depending on who else was involved. The problem is that these cases are extremely difficult to win once the property has already changed hands and the buyer has taken possession." He explained that Claire had covered her tracks well, had used her professional credentials as a notary and her position at a respected real estate firm to create documentation that looked legitimate on the surface, and that the title company and buyer had no reason to question the authorization when everything appeared properly notarized and filed. "These cases take years and cost upward of $100,000 in legal fees," he continued, and I felt my brief hope start to crumble. "Do you have those kinds of resources?" I thought about my graphic design business, which had grown steadily over the past 3 years, to the point where I was making around $65,000 a year. Enough to live comfortably, but nowhere near enough to fund a protracted legal battle against my sister, who had just pocketed $1.3 million. "No," I admitted. "I don't." Derek Chen leaned back in his chair and studied me for a long moment. "What you'd need is irrefutable proof of your sister's intent to defraud. Not just proof that she forged your signature, but proof that she knew she was committing fraud, that she deliberately violated her professional obligations, that there was no legitimate justification for her actions." I thought about Claire's words on the phone, her claim that Grandma had been confused, that the will was a mistake, and suddenly I remembered the competency hearing. "My grandmother had early-stage dementia," I said slowly, "but she was legally cleared as competent when she made the will. There were doctor's assessments, psychiatric evaluations, witnesses at the will reading. Her lawyer made absolutely sure that the will couldn't be contested on grounds of diminished capacity. Claire's claim that Grandma was confused is disprovable." Derek Chen sat forward, interested now. "Do you have access to those medical records?" I nodded, remembering that Grandma's lawyer had given me copies of everything, that I had a thick folder of documents in my storage unit proving beyond any doubt that Grandma Rose had been of sound mind when she chose to leave me the condo, when she deliberately excluded Claire from that particular asset, even though she'd left other things to both of us. I started investigating the next day with a determination I'd never felt before. And the first thing I did was search public property records for the Santa Monica condo, which in California are accessible online through the county assessor's website. What I found made my stomach drop even further than it already had. Claire had sold the condo for $1.3 million to something called Coastal Holdings LLC on March 15th, exactly 3 weeks ago. But when I traced the property forward, I discovered that Coastal Holdings LLC had immediately resold it just 5 days later for $1.8 million to Pacific Luxury Developers, a well-known company that specialized in converting beachfront properties into high-end vacation rentals. Claire hadn't just stolen my inheritance. She'd stolen an additional $500,000 by flipping it to a developer using insider knowledge from her real estate firm. I sat at Jordan's kitchen table staring at the records on my laptop, understanding with growing clarity that this wasn't an impulsive decision or even just straightforward theft, but a carefully planned scheme to maximize her profit at my expense. I dug deeper into Coastal Holdings LLC, searching business registration records, and when I found the company's registered agent, my hands started shaking. Marcus Chen, Claire's boyfriend of 2 years, the smooth-talking investment banker she'd been dating since she met him at some real estate networking event, the man who'd come to exactly 2 family dinners and spent both of them checking his phone. This wasn't just fraud. This was conspiracy. Claire and Marcus had planned this together, had created a shell company specifically to hide the transaction, to make it look like an arm's-length sale to a legitimate buyer, when in reality it was just a way station to pump up the price before selling to the actual end buyer. I called Derek Chen back and told him what I'd found, and I could hear the excitement in his voice, even though he was trying to maintain professional composure. "That's good," he said. "That's very good. It establishes a pattern of deception and shows financial motive beyond just taking the property." But I wasn't done yet. I called the title company that had handled the transaction, Pacific Coast Title, and when the representative answered, I took a deep breath and said I was Maya Rodriguez, and I needed copies of all documents related to the sale of the Santa Monica property for tax purposes. The representative was helpful and friendly, and 3 hours later, I had a PDF in my inbox containing every single document from the transaction. I opened the file with Jordan looking over my shoulder, and there it was on page 12, the notarized authorization of sale, bearing my forged signature and Claire's notary stamp. The date on the notarization was March 8th. I started laughing, and Jordan looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but I couldn't stop because March 8th was the day I'd been in San Francisco at the West Coast Design Conference, the day I'd given my presentation on brand identity for small businesses, the day I'd posted about a dozen Instagram stories from the convention center and had dinner with 3 potential clients at a restaurant in the Marina District. I had hotel receipts, a conference badge, Instagram posts with location tags, emails sent from my laptop showing the San Francisco IP address, and a signed contract from a client I'd met that evening. There was no possible way I could have been in Los Angeles, signing documents in front of Claire's notary stamp. My sister had made a crucial mistake, and now I had irrefutable proof that her notarization was fraudulent, that she'd abused her professional authority, that every word she'd said about having proper authorization was a lie. I went back to Derek Chen's office the following morning with my laptop, my phone, and a folder containing printed copies of every piece of evidence I'd collected. And when I spread it all out on his conference table, his expression transformed from professional interest to something close to excitement. "This is exactly what we need," he said, examining the notarization document next to my San Francisco hotel receipt and the Instagram posts showing me at the convention center at the exact time Claire claimed to have notarized my signature in Los Angeles. "This isn't just provable fraud, Maya. This is abuse of notary public authority, which in California is a felony. Your sister didn't just forge your signature, she used her professional credentials to legitimize that forgery, and now we can prove she did it on a day when you were physically in another city." He explained that we could file both criminal charges with the district attorney's office and a civil lawsuit for fraud, conspiracy, and damages, that the criminal case would be handled by prosecutors while the civil case would seek to recover the property value, plus all the additional profit Claire had made through the shell company scheme. We spent 3 hours that day preparing documents, drafting complaints, compiling evidence into a presentation that even I could see was damning. And when we finally filed everything 2 days later, I felt something shift inside me, some long-dormant sense of my own power beginning to wake up. Claire was served with the lawsuit and the criminal complaint on a Tuesday afternoon at her real estate office, and I know this because she called me exactly 47 minutes later, and I'd never heard her voice sound like that before. shaking with a rage that seemed to come from some deep place of disbelief that I had dared to challenge her. "You ungrateful bitch," she said, not even bothering with hello. "After everything our family did for you, after we put up with your drama and your problems for your entire life, this is how you repay us? You're trying to send me to prison over a simple business transaction?" I was sitting in Jordan's living room and my hands were trembling, but my voice came out steadier than I expected. "You forged my signature and stole my inheritance. I have proof. You're going to prison, Claire." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then she laughed, but it sounded forced and brittle. "No one will believe you over me. I'm a licensed professional with 15 years in real estate. You're a freelance graphic designer who barely makes rent. I have credibility and connections and lawyers who will tear your little case apart." I thought about the notarization dated March 8th, about my hotel receipt and my Instagram posts and my signed client contract, about the shell company registered to Marcus and the $500,000 profit she'd made through insider knowledge, and I felt something like calm settle over me. "Then I guess we'll see you in court," I said, and hung up before she could respond, and it was the first time in my entire life I'd ever ended a conversation with my sister on my own terms. My mother called 4 days after I filed the lawsuit, her voice tight and controlled in that way that meant she was furious, but trying to maintain composure, and she said, "Your father and I expect you for dinner on Sunday. We need to discuss this situation with Claire." I almost said no, almost told her I had nothing to discuss, but some old instinct toward obedience made me agree, and that's how I found myself walking up to my parents' house in Pasadena on Sunday evening with my stomach in knots and Jordan's voice in my head telling me I didn't owe them anything. They were already seated in the dining room when I arrived, all of them, Claire at my father's right hand looking pale and angry, my mother at the opposite end with her mouth set in a thin line, and my younger brother Tyler looking anywhere but at me as I took the only empty chair. My father didn't wait for me to settle before he started. "Maya, your mother and I are very disappointed in you. This lawsuit against your sister is tearing this family apart over money, and we raised you better than that." I tried to keep my voice steady. "This isn't about money, Dad. Claire committed fraud. She forged my signature and stole property that Grandma left specifically to me." My mother made a dismissive gesture with her hand, the same gesture she'd been making my entire life when I said something she didn't want to hear. "Grandma would want you two to get along. She would be heartbroken to see you fighting like this." Claire leaned forward, and I could see she'd been crying, which was a performance I recognized from childhood, the tears she could summon whenever she needed our parents' sympathy. "I made a business decision, Maya. The condo was sitting empty half the time, and you weren't managing it properly. I got you more than it was worth. This is how you repay me?" I looked at my father, waiting for him to say something about the forgery, about the notarized documents dated when I was in San Francisco, about the shell company and the conspiracy. But instead, he said, "Claire has always been good with real estate. You weren't using the property properly anyway. This legal action is excessive." Something crystallized in that moment, some understanding I'd been avoiding my entire life, and I realized with absolute clarity that they would always choose Claire, would always find a way to make her the victim and me the problem, would never see what she'd done as wrong, because acknowledging it would require them to admit they'd enabled her cruelty for 28 years. Tyler was staring at his plate, his jaw tight, uncomfortable but unwilling to contradict our parents, and I understood he wouldn't help me, couldn't help me, because he was still living in this house and still dependent on their approval. I stood up, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor, and my voice came out stronger than I'd ever heard it. "Claire committed a felony. She forged my signature, she abused her professional credentials, and she stole from me. She's going to face consequences for that, whether you support me or not." My mother's face went white and then red, and she stood as well, her voice shaking. "If you pursue this, Maya, you are choosing to destroy this family. Don't come back to this house until you're ready to apologize to your sister and drop these ridiculous charges." I looked at each of them, My father's disapproving frown, my mother's righteous anger, Claire's satisfied smirk, Tyler's guilty silence. And I felt something break and something else grow strong in the space it left behind. "Then I guess I won't be coming back," I said, and walked out of that dining room and out of that house, and my mother's final words followed me into the night. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." But for the first time ever, I knew with absolute certainty that the mistake would be staying. 3 months passed in a strange blur of legal proceedings and silence, and I moved through those weeks with a focus I'd never experienced before. Working with Derek Chen as the civil case built momentum, and the district attorney's office pursued the criminal investigation with surprising enthusiasm. Derek told me that prosecutors loved cases with clear evidence, and mine was apparently a prosecutor's dream. Concrete and documented and impossible to explain away, and within 6 weeks of filing the criminal complaint, the DA's investigator had uncovered something even I hadn't known about. 2 other instances where Claire had fraudulently notarized documents, one for a client who'd been out of the country at the time, and another for a colleague who later complained but never filed charges. It was a pattern of behavior, the investigator explained to me in Derek's office, and patterns were what built criminal cases from isolated incidents into proof of criminal intent. The developer who'd bought the property from Marcus's LLC was furious when he learned the title was disputed, that he'd purchased a property at the center of a fraud investigation. And his lawyers sent Claire a letter threatening a separate lawsuit for concealing the disputed title and causing him financial harm through delayed development plans. I heard through Tyler, who texted me occasionally with updates he thought I should know, that Claire's real estate license had been suspended pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. That the California Bureau of Real Estate took notary fraud extremely seriously, and she wouldn't be able to work in her field until everything was resolved, if ever. Marcus broke up with her, Tyler said, once he realized his LLC was implicated in the fraud scheme and his own business reputation was at risk, and I felt a small mean satisfaction at that, before feeling guilty for being petty. My parents still blamed me for everything, still called this a family dispute I was blowing out of proportion, still sent occasional messages through Tyler suggesting I drop the charges and work this out privately. But I'd stopped expecting anything different from them, and the messages no longer had the power to make me doubt myself. Then one evening in early July, Tyler called and asked if he could come over to Jordan's apartment, said he had something I needed to see, and when he arrived 40 minutes later, he looked nervous and excited in equal measure. He pulled an envelope from his messenger bag, old-fashioned cream stationery with my parents' names written in Grandma Rose's distinctive handwriting, and he said, "I found this in Mom's safe when I was looking for my birth certificate. I think Grandma sent it to them right after she updated her will. I don't think they ever told you it existed." My hands were shaking as I opened it, unfolding 3 pages of Grandma's careful script dated 14 months earlier, 2 months before she died, and as I started reading I felt tears blur the words and had to stop and breathe before I could continue. The letter began with, "Dear Susan and Robert," in Grandma's formal way, and then it said everything I'd needed my parents to hear for my entire life. Everything Grandma had apparently tried to tell them a year ago that they'd chosen to ignore. "I'm writing to explain my decision to leave the Santa Monica condo to Maya, because I know you'll question it, and I want you to understand my reasoning while I'm still clear-headed enough to articulate it. I've watched all 3 of my grandchildren grow up, and I've watched how differently you treat them. How Claire has always been your golden child, while Maya has been dismissed and overlooked, despite having the kindest heart of all of them. Maya visited me every single week for the past 6 years, not on Christmas or Thanksgiving when she was obligated, but on random Tuesdays and Wednesday afternoons, because she genuinely wanted to spend time with me and hear my stories about your father and our early years together. She helped me with groceries when my hands got too shaky to carry bags. She drove me to chemo appointments and held my hand through the nausea. She organized my medications and helped me sort through 70 years of accumulated possessions when I moved to the smaller apartment. And never once, not one single time, did she ask about my will or my estate planning or what I intended to leave to whom. I had to stop reading because tears were blurring the words, and Tyler put his hand on my shoulder and waited while I wiped my eyes and steadied my breathing before continuing. Claire, in contrast, visited me exactly 4 times in the past 2 years, and 3 of those visits included questions about my estate planning or suggestions about how I should protect my assets, or comments about how valuable the condo had become. The last time she came, 6 months before I'm writing this letter, she spent 20 minutes talking about her real estate expertise and how she could help me maximize the value of my property portfolio when we both know I only own the condo and my car. She didn't ask about my health or my friends or whether I was lonely. She assessed my assets. Tyler is a sweet boy, but he's young and still finding himself, and I'm leaving him a financial gift he'll receive when he turns 30. But Maya is the one who loved me for myself and not for what I could give her, and that's why she's receiving the property. The letter continued for another page, detailing specific instances Grandma had observed of Claire manipulating me and my parents enabling it, moments I'd thought no one else had noticed or cared about. And she wrote, I watched Claire take credit for Maya's design work at Tyler's graduation party. Watched you both praise Claire's creativity while Maya stood there silent, and I wanted to scream. I watched Claire convince you that Maya was irresponsible with money, when the truth is, Maya has been supporting herself completely since college. While Claire still asks you for loans, she never repays. I watched you dismiss Maya's business success as cute, while treating Claire's real estate job as a serious career, when Maya makes almost as much and works twice as hard. The final paragraph made me sob outright. I'm leaving Maya the condo because she loved me, not my assets, and I'm asking you to protect her from Claire's jealousy, to support this decision, to finally see Maya for the remarkable young woman she is, instead of the overlooked middle child you've made her feel like her entire life. She deserves this. She earned it through years of genuine love and care. Please, for once, choose her. When I finished reading, I looked up at Tyler through tears, and he was crying too, and he said quietly, I never knew Grandma saw everything so clearly. I never knew she tried to tell them. I folded the letter carefully, reverently, this final gift from the grandmother who'd seen me when no one else would, and I understood that she'd tried to protect me even after death, that she'd given my parents every opportunity to do the right thing, and they'd chosen Claire anyway, just like they always had. The mediation was scheduled for mid-August in a conference room at the civil courthouse downtown, one of those deliberately neutral spaces with beige walls and a long table and windows that looked out over the perpetual traffic on Spring Street. And I arrived 20 minutes early with Derek Chen, carrying 2 briefcases full of documentation we'd assembled over 4 months of investigation and legal preparation. Claire arrived exactly on time with her attorney, Gerald Hutchinson, who I recognized from online research as one of those expensive defense lawyers who specialized in white-collar crime, the kind who charged $800 an hour and wore suits that cost more than my monthly rent. And Claire herself looked different than I'd ever seen her, diminished somehow despite the obviously expensive navy dress and the perfect makeup, her confidence visibly cracked at the edges in a way that gave me no satisfaction at all. The mediator was a retired judge named Patricia Valdez, a woman in her late 60s with steel gray hair and an expression that suggested she'd seen every variety of human dishonesty and wasn't impressed by any of it. And she spent the first 15 minutes reviewing the case file while we all sat in uncomfortable silence, the only sound the whisper of turning pages and the muted traffic noise from outside. When Judge Valdez finally looked up, she directed her attention to Claire and her lawyer and said in a tone that was professionally neutral but unmistakably pointed, Ms. Rodriguez, I've reviewed the evidence submitted by both parties, and I need to be very clear with you about the situation you're facing. The plaintiff has documentation proving that your notarization of the sale documents occurred on March 15th, when Ms. Maya Rodriguez can demonstrate through hotel receipts, time-stamped photographs, client meeting confirmations, and credit card transactions that she was in San Francisco attending a professional conference. That alone constitutes felony fraud and abuse of your notary public commission. Additionally, the district attorney's investigation has uncovered 2 previous instances of fraudulent notarization in your professional history, which establishes a pattern of criminal behavior rather than a one-time error in judgment. I watched Claire's face as the judge spoke, watched her expensive lawyer shift uncomfortably in his chair and exchange a glance with Claire that clearly communicated this was worse than he'd prepared her for. And Claire herself had gone very pale under her foundation, her hands clasped so tightly on the table in front of her that her knuckles were white. Judge Valdez continued, methodically dismantling every element of Claire's defense, explaining that the shell company scheme involving Marcus's LLC added conspiracy charges, that the $500,000 profit from the immediate resale demonstrated clear intent to defraud rather than any good faith misunderstanding about the will, that the falsified claims about Grandma Rose's mental competency were contradicted by multiple doctors' assessments and witness statements from the will signing. Based on the evidence before me, Judge Valdez said, looking directly at Claire with those sharp eyes that missed nothing, you're facing 3 to 5 years in state prison, permanent revocation of your real estate and notary licenses, and restitution orders that would likely exceed $2 million. The evidence against you is, frankly, overwhelming and largely incontrovertible. Gerald Hutchinson cleared his throat and said, Your Honor, we're here in good faith to explore settlement options that might resolve this matter without the expense and uncertainty of trial. And Judge Valdez nodded and said, Then let me propose terms that reflect the severity of the fraud while offering your client an opportunity to avoid incarceration. Ms. Claire Rodriguez will return the full $1.3 million from the sale, plus the $500,000 profit from the subsequent resale, plus $200,000 in damages and legal fees, for a total payment of $2 million to Ms. Maya Rodriguez. The payment will represent either the return of the property itself or, if that's no longer feasible given the completed sale to the developer, the equivalent cash value plus damages. In exchange, Maya Rodriguez will agree not to pursue the criminal charges, though the district attorney's office will make its own determination about the notary fraud pattern. This settlement would allow Ms. Claire Rodriguez to avoid prison time while making the plaintiff whole. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of Claire's sharp intake of breath, and when I looked at her directly for the first time since we'd entered the room, her face showed complete shock, genuine disbelief that this was actually happening, that her careful planning and professional credentials and lifetime of being the chosen one weren't going to protect her from consequences. That's everything I have, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And I heard in those 4 words the first real fear I'd ever heard from my sister, the golden child who'd never faced real accountability for anything in her entire privileged life. Judge Valdez gave us 30 minutes to discuss the settlement offer privately, and Derek and I moved to a smaller conference room down the hall where he closed the door and sat across from me with his legal pad covered in notes and said, Maya, I need to be direct with you about what we're facing here. If we go to trial, I'm 95% confident we'll win. The evidence is overwhelming. Claire's fraud is documented beyond any reasonable doubt, and a jury will be sympathetic to your position. But trials are unpredictable, and more importantly, they take time. We're looking at minimum 8 months before we'd get a court date, possibly longer given the criminal case complications, and that's 8 more months of legal fees, depositions, stress, and uncertainty. This settlement offer guarantees you get made whole right now, today, with a signed agreement and a payment schedule we can enforce. $2 million. That's more than the original property value, It includes every penny she stole plus damages, and it means you can move forward with your life instead of spending the next year consumed by litigation. I sat there looking at my hands, thinking about what Grandma Rose would want, wondering if she'd expect me to fight this all the way to a criminal conviction, or if she'd counsel me to take the certainty of justice over the satisfaction of revenge. And I realized that everything she'd taught me, every conversation we'd had about kindness and integrity and choosing your battles, pointed toward restoration rather than destruction. "I'll accept the settlement," I said slowly, watching Derek's face relax slightly with relief. "But I have one non-negotiable condition. Claire has to give a public apology, a real one, where she admits specifically what she did, the fraud and the forgery and the conspiracy, and she has to do it in front of our family so they can hear the truth directly from her instead of my version that they've spent months dismissing. And I want a no-contact provision, minimum 5 years, where she agrees to stay completely away from me, no communication, no showing up at places she knows I'll be, nothing. I need space to build a life that doesn't include looking over my shoulder waiting for the next manipulation." Derek nodded and made notes. Then we returned to the mediation room where Judge Valdez asked if we'd reached a position, and Derek outlined my terms, the $2 million payment plus the formal apology and the 5-year no-contact order, and I watched Claire's face transform from fearful hope to outrage as she realized I wasn't going to let her buy her way out of public accountability. "I won't humiliate myself," Claire said, her voice sharp with the old authority she was used to wielding over me, that tone that had always made me back down and doubt myself and apologize for taking up space. "You can have the money, but I'm not going to stand up and degrade myself in front of our parents and admit to things that make me sound like a criminal." Judge Valdez looked at her with an expression that somehow combined professional neutrality with barely concealed contempt and said, "Ms. Rodriguez, you are a criminal. You committed multiple felonies. The choice before you is whether you admit that privately in a controlled setting that Ms. Maya Rodriguez is willing to limit to family witnesses, or whether we proceed to trial where your admissions will become public court record, covered by media, searchable online forever, followed by years in state prison. I strongly suggest you consider which option serves your interests better." Gerald Hutchinson leaned close to Claire, and they had a whispered conversation that lasted 3 minutes, his expression increasingly firm as he apparently explained the reality of her situation in terms even her denial couldn't dismiss. And finally, Claire turned back to face the table and said in a voice that shook slightly, "Fine, I'll do the apology, but I want it limited to immediate family only, and I want the recording kept confidential, not posted online or shared beyond the people in the room." I looked at Derek and he nodded slightly, indicating this was reasonable, and I said, "Agreed. The apology happens next week at your office, Derek, with our parents and Tyler present, recorded and notarized by an independent notary, and once it's complete and the payment schedule is signed, this is over." The apology was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon at Derek Chen's law office in Century City, a deliberate choice of neutral territory where everything could be properly documented and witnessed. And I arrived 15 minutes early with my stomach in knots, not from fear, but from the strange anticipation of finally hearing my sister acknowledge what she'd done to me after a lifetime of denials and deflections and casual cruelty disguised as concern. Derek had arranged the conference room with careful attention to the formalities we'd agreed upon. A notary public named Barbara Stevens, who had no connection to either family, a video camera set up on a tripod to record the proceedings, and copies of the settlement agreement stacked neatly on the table next to the prepared statement Claire would read. Tyler arrived next, giving me a tight hug and whispering, "I'm here for you," before taking a seat beside me. And I felt grateful beyond words that at least one member of my family had chosen to see the truth instead of the comfortable fiction our parents had constructed around Claire's golden child perfection. My parents came 10 minutes late, my mother's face set in lines of martyred suffering, as though she were the one being wronged by this entire proceeding. my father's expression carved from stone and disappointment, and neither of them looked at me directly as they took seats on the opposite side of the table, as far from me as the room's dimensions would allow. Claire was last to arrive with Gerald Hutchinson, and she looked smaller somehow than I'd ever seen her, diminished not just by circumstance, but by the visible weight of consequences she'd never had to carry before. Her expensive clothes and perfect makeup, unable to conceal the fear and humiliation in her eyes. Barbara Stevens began the proceeding by confirming everyone's identity for the record, explaining that this was a formal statement being given as part of a legal settlement agreement, and then she nodded to Claire and said, "You may read your statement now." Claire's hands shook slightly as she picked up the paper Derek had prepared based on our negotiations, and her voice when she began was barely above a whisper, forcing her to start again with more volume. "My name is Claire Elizabeth Rodriguez, and I am making this statement of my own free will as part of a settlement agreement with my sister Maya Rose Rodriguez. On or about March 15th, I fraudulently notarized documents purporting to authorize the sale of property located at 2847 Ocean Avenue in Santa Monica, California, property that had been legally bequeathed to Maya Rodriguez by our grandmother Rose Martinez. I forged Maya's signature on these documents, knowing she had not consented to the sale and knowing she was not present for the notarization, which constitutes felony fraud and abuse of my notary public commission. I conspired with Marcus Brennan to sell the property through a shell corporation for $1.3 million and then immediately resell it to a developer for $1.8 million, personally profiting approximately $500,000 from this scheme. I engaged in this criminal behavior because I was jealous of Maya's relationship with our grandmother and believed I was more entitled to the inheritance than she was. I allowed my jealousy and sense of entitlement to drive me to commit fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. I apologized to Maya for stealing her inheritance, for betraying her trust, and for the emotional harm I have caused. I commit to paying her $2 million in restitution over the next 90 days, according to the payment schedule we have agreed upon, and I agree to have no contact with her for a minimum of 5 years. The silence that followed was absolute and terrible, broken only by my mother's sharp intake of breath and the soft whir of the video camera, and I sat there watching my sister's face as she set down the paper with shaking hands, and realized I felt none of the triumph I'd expected, none of the vindication I'd imagined during the long months of legal battle. Instead, I felt profoundly sad, mourning not just the grandmother I'd lost, but the sister I'd never really had. The relationship that might have existed if Claire had ever seen me as anything other than competition, if our parents had ever loved us equally, instead of choosing favorites and pitting us against each other. My mother stood abruptly and said in a voice tight with anger, "Are you satisfied now, Maya? You've humiliated your sister and torn this family apart." And my father followed her toward the door without a word, and I watched them leave without trying to stop them, understanding finally that their approval was something I would never receive and no longer needed. Tyler stayed beside me as Barbara Stevens completed the notarization and Derek collected the signed settlement documents. And when it was finally over and Claire had left with her lawyer, my brother put his arm around my shoulders and said, "You did the right thing, Maya. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. Sorry I let them make you feel like you were the problem all those years. Grandma saw the truth about all of us, and she was right about you." The settlement agreement specified a payment schedule of 3 installments over 90 days, and Claire made the first payment of $667,000 within a week of the apology. The second arrived exactly 30 days later, and on the 60th day after that recorded statement in Derek Chen's office, I received the wire transfer notification for the final $666,000 that brought the total to exactly $2 million as agreed. Derek had already deducted his legal fees from the total, approximately $380,000 that covered 18 months of investigation, filing, negotiations, and the mediation process, and after setting aside another $220,000 for federal and state taxes, on what the IRS classified as settlement income, I was left with $1.4 million in clear funds, more money than I'd ever imagined having, and more than enough to build the life Grandma Rose had wanted for me. The condo itself was already sold to the developer, the sale legally valid once I'd been properly compensated for the fraudulent transaction. So instead of fighting to reclaim the physical property, I took the cash value and started looking for a new place that could be truly mine without the shadow of Claire's theft hanging over it. I found a smaller condo in Venice Beach, just under 1,000 square feet compared to the Santa Monica property's 1,400, but it had floor-to-ceiling windows in the living room and a balcony that overlooked the ocean. And standing there during the showing, I could almost hear Grandma Rose saying, "This is perfect, mija. This is exactly right." So I bought it outright for $890,000 without needing a mortgage, something that gave me a feeling of security I'd never experienced before. With the remaining $510,000, I made the decision that scared and excited me in equal measure. I invested $200,000 into expanding my graphic design freelance work into a proper boutique agency, something I'd dreamed about for years, but never had the capital or confidence to pursue. I rented a small office space in Culver City, bought proper equipment and software licenses, hired 3 employees, including a junior designer, a project manager, and a part-time business development consultant, and I rebranded from Maya Rodriguez Design to Rose Creative Agency in honor of my grandmother, who had made it all possible. The business took off faster than I'd projected, my existing client relationships providing a foundation, and the new team allowing us to take on larger projects I'd had to turn down as a solo freelancer. And within 4 months, we were consistently billing $35,000 per month, with a pipeline that promised continued growth. My parents still didn't speak to me, their silence now stretching past a year, but I discovered that the absence of their criticism and conditional love felt more like relief than loss, and I stopped checking my phone, hoping for messages that never came. Tyler visited every 2 weeks, sometimes more often, our relationship growing stronger now that he'd stepped out of our parents' shadow and started making his own judgments about who deserved his loyalty. And he told me Claire had moved to Phoenix and was working as an administrative assistant since her notary license was permanently revoked and her real estate career was finished. I sent the remaining $310,000 to a financial advisor Jordan recommended, investing it conservatively for long-term growth, and for the first time in my life, I felt financially secure, professionally fulfilled, and emotionally free from the family dynamics that had defined and diminished me for 28 years. 1 year after that recorded apology in Derek Chen's office, on a Thursday evening in late September, I was sitting on my balcony in Venice Beach, watching the sun sink toward the Pacific Ocean in shades of orange and pink that reminded me of the sunsets Grandma Rose used to watch from her Santa Monica condo, and Rose Creative Agency had grown beyond anything I'd imagined possible when I'd invested that $200,000 in starting it, now generating $400,000 in annual revenue with a client roster that included 3 major tech companies and a luxury hotel chain that had found us through a feature article in Pacific Design Magazine's spring issue highlighting emerging creative studios in Los Angeles. My phone rang and I almost didn't answer when I saw Mom on the screen, 14 months of silence making the sight of her name feel surreal and slightly threatening. But something made me swipe to accept the call and say, "Hello," in a voice that sounded calmer than I felt. "Maya, it's your mother," she said as though I might not recognize her after a year, her tone formal and uncomfortable. "Your father and I would like to talk with you if you're willing. Would you meet us for dinner?" I agreed before I'd fully processed what I was doing. And 3 days later, I found myself sitting across from Susan and Robert Rodriguez at a quiet Italian restaurant in Brentwood, neutral territory where none of us had history or memories to navigate around. They looked older than I remembered, my father's hair grayer at the temples and my mother's face lined with tension that hadn't been there before. Or maybe I'd just never noticed, because I'd been too busy trying to earn approval that was never going to come. We made awkward small talk about the weather and traffic for nearly 10 minutes before my father cleared his throat and said, "Tyler showed us your grandmother's letter, the one she wrote to us explaining her decision about the inheritance." My mother's hands fidgeted with her napkin and she added quickly, "We didn't know it existed. We found it when we were going through some old files in the safe, and Tyler insisted we read it." There was a long pause and then my father continued, his voice stiff but not unkind. "We didn't know how Claire had been treating you over the years. We didn't realize the extent of it. Your grandmother saw things we should have seen." It wasn't quite an apology, not the full acknowledgement I might have wanted years ago, but it was more than I'd ever expected to receive from them. My mother looked directly at me for the first time since we'd sat down and said, "We heard about your business success, the magazine feature, and everything you've built. We're proud of you, Maya." And those words that I'd waited my entire life to hear hung in the air between us, and I discovered they didn't carry the weight or power I'd always imagined they would. Didn't fill the hollow place inside me that had ached for parental validation for 29 years. Because somewhere in the past year, I'd stopped needing their pride to feel worthy. "Thank you," I said simply, meaning it, but not needing it. "I appreciate you saying that." We spent the next hour talking through what a rebuilt relationship might look like, and I surprised myself with how clear and firm I was about setting boundaries that would have been impossible for the old Maya, who desperately needed their approval to feel whole. I told them I was willing to have monthly dinners and include them in my life, but I wouldn't tolerate being compared to Claire or having my business and personal decisions questioned or second-guessed the way they'd done my entire childhood. I said I needed them to acknowledge that they'd failed to protect me from Claire's cruelty and that their favoritism had caused real damage that couldn't be fixed with one awkward restaurant conversation. My father looked uncomfortable but nodded, and my mother said, "We understand," in a voice that suggested she didn't fully understand but was willing to try, and that tentative acceptance felt like enough for now, a foundation we could maybe build on if we were all willing to do the work. They asked about Claire, whether I'd heard from her, and I told them Tyler had mentioned she'd reached out to him 6 months ago, asking him to pass along a message that she was sorry and wanted to talk when I was ready. I said I wasn't ready and might never be ready, that the 5-year no-contact agreement from the settlement was a boundary I needed and intended to honor regardless of whether she wanted forgiveness or reconciliation. My mother looked like she wanted to push back, to say something about sisters needing to forgive each other or family being more important than grudges, but she caught herself and just said, "That's your choice to make." And that small moment of respecting my decision felt more meaningful than all the years of unwanted advice that had come before. I was at peace with my decision about Claire because I'd finally learned what Grandma Rose had tried to teach me in giving me that inheritance. The condo wasn't really about the money or the property. It was about validation, about having someone who mattered look at me and say, "I see your worth. I see who you really are, and I'm proving it in a way no one can deny." The legal battle that followed, as painful and exhausting as it had been, taught me that I didn't need everyone to recognize my value, just the right people, and most importantly, I needed to recognize it myself. Grandma Rose had known I was capable and worthy and strong enough to fight for what was mine, even when I didn't know it yet, and the inheritance was her way of forcing me to see myself the way she'd always seen me. I'd built a life now that reflected that worth. A business I was proud of, a home that was truly mine, relationships with people like Jordan and Tyler who valued me for who I actually was rather than who they wanted me to be, and a hard-won sense of self that didn't crumble every time someone questioned my choices or capabilities. That Thursday evening, 2 months after the dinner with my parents and 18 months after Claire's recorded apology, I sat in my office at Rose Creative Agency after everyone else had gone home, looking at the framed photo of Grandma Rose I kept on my desk, The one where she's laughing at something I'd said during one of our Tuesday afternoon visits. And I said out loud to her image, "You knew exactly what you were doing, didn't you? You gave me the foundation to build my own life, and I finally have." The sunset through my office window painted everything in shades of gold, and I felt something I'd been searching for my entire life finally settle into place. The deep, unshakable knowledge that I was enough, exactly as I was. And I didn't need anyone's permission or approval to take up space in the world.